And the communicators' coverage from the cable show in Boston continues this week. Up next are interviews with two members of the Federal Trade Commission. Well, we want to introduce you to one of the Federal Trade Commission's new commissioners, and this is Maureen Olhausen on your screen. She's a Republican member of the 5-member commission. Maureen Olhausen, you've been on the board for about a month now, on the commission for about a month.
Yes, a little over a month.
What's your experience been like?
Well, it's been very positive. As I had mentioned when we were talking previously, I'm returning to the FTC. I'd been here for 12 years previously, so in a way it's a big homecoming for me, which I appreciate, but of course playing a different role as a commissioner. So I've enjoyed kind of reconnecting with people that I've known, worked with in the past, but also getting briefed on all the new activities, the new cases, investigations, projects the FTC is undertaking.
What were some of your previous positions at the FTC?
So my last position at the FTC before I left is I was head of the Office of Policy Planning. And then before that I'd been an attorney advisor to a commissioner, and then I'd worked in the general counsel's office when I first started.
How did you get started with the FTC?
Well, I was very fortunate when I went to law school. I had several professors who were very inspiring to me in the area of antitrust, and they got me interested in the FTC. But when I graduated, I was fortunate enough to have a clerkship. I worked on the U.S. Court of Appeals through the D.C. Circuit. And I enjoyed that very much, but then when I got the opportunity to start at the FTC in the General Counsel's office, I made the leap over to there because I knew I wanted to practice in that area.
Well, we're catching up with you here in Boston at the annual cable show. Why are you up here?
Well, I'm up here because I think there's a lot going on that the FTC is paying attention to in the communications media spaces, certainly. So when I was head of the Office of Policy Planning, I headed up the Internet Access Task Force, and we looked at issues involving Internet access over broadband and certainly new technologies, new ways of delivering services to consumers. So definitely, cable plays an important role in that.
What are some of those issues that you're personally concerned with, or that the FTC is looking into currently?
So some of the issues that we're looking into involve privacy. Certainly that's a big issue for the FTC and for consumers these days. We're also looking, we always look at kind of the bread and butter issues of advertising, competitive issues, competition across platforms. Right now, there's a big amount of convergence going on, where previously separate industries are starting to compete with each other. So to make good policy, to make the best outcomes for consumers, we really need to understand what's happening in the industry and in the market.
When it comes to convergence, Commissioner Olhausen, are there some concerns? Do you have some personal concerns about some of the industries and the overlaps that we're seeing these days?
Well, I mean, not so much concerns. I think there are great potential to increase competition for consumers when you start having previously separate industries competing to be the broadband provider, to be the voice provider. One of the issues that creates a little complication for the FTC is that we have a common carrier exemption to our statute. And so if some of the industries are common carriers, that can create a little bit of an issue for us to be able to address some things. I mean, basically the FTC has been able to still reach a lot of areas in privacy and advertising, antitrust kind of issues, but that's something that, a little more and more is becoming an issue for the FTC.
Now, very quickly, define common carrier for viewers who may not know.
So a common carrier would be, basically, it's like voice common carrier. It would also include airlines, railroads. So it's an industry that has to serve all comers, basically. Now, cable service and broadband service has not been defined as a common carrier service, so that doesn't present an issue in that area. But once cable starts to compete with traditional voice common carrier service, that can just create a few kind of complications the FTC needs to look at.
Now, have there been efforts to make broadband a common carrier?
Well, that's up to the FCC for the most part, and in the Brand X decision, the Supreme Court upheld the FCC's decision basically they said they were not going to classify broadband as a common carrier service.
Now, Maureen Olhausen, where does the FTC intersect with the FCC on issues? And do you work with the other commissioners? How does that work?
So the FTC and the FCC do work together on a number of issues. Right now, they work together, particularly on privacy issues, on a lot of telemarketing issues, actually. The do not call rule, which the FTC played an important role in, the FCC also has a role in as well, so there's coordination on that. Any issues involving advertising, certain billing issues, the FTC has worked with the FCC on addressing cramming issues. Now, the FTC can't reach a common carrier, but they can reach somebody else in the chain that might be involved in cramming unauthorized charges onto consumers' bills.
Well, you've mentioned privacy a couple times, and the FTC is the lead agency, essentially, when it comes to privacy.
Yes.
What is the status? The recent privacy report came out by the FTC, but did you sign on to it as a new commissioner?
I did not. So that was issued before I came on the commission. And basically, the FTC is primarily an enforcement agency and has brought many, many good cases in the consumer privacy area and has reached settlements with a lot of companies, Google, Facebook, about some of the promises, privacy promises that they made to consumers and, requiring them to honor those promises. And the report discussed a lot of those issues and the need for, more thinking in the area of consumer privacy. The report also included a recommendation to Congress to adopt general consumer privacy legislation. And, I didn't sign on to that, and that's an area that I'd like to explore more fully before I would feel comfortable making a similar recommendation.
Now, you didn't sign on because of the newness of your position or because you disagree with it?
Well, a little bit of both. So I feel the need, so while I support the FTC's enforcement in privacy and paying attention to this issue and looking closely at it, I feel the need to sort of educate myself a little more fully on what are some of the harms that are occurring in the market that the FTC can't reach right now or that other legislation, existing statutes can't reach right now, and whether, how broad general privacy legislation should be. And also, the FTC is a competition agency, and so I think we also need to take a look at what could be some of the competitive effects if there are new legislation that might have an impact on the ability of competitors to reach consumers or to use information in a way to innovate and sharpen competition that way.
Maureen Olhausen, what about do not track when it comes to online issues? We all know about the cell phone or the wireline phone issues when
Yes.
it comes to do not track. But what about when it comes to cell phones and online? Where's the FTC in that issue?
So the FTC is looking at that issue and has been very supportive of some of the self-regulatory efforts that are underway. There is a sort of a technology-based effort that the W3C has undertaken, and I've just been meeting with some of the members of that working group in the past week to find out kind of what the status of that is. And there's also the Digital Advertising Alliance has a large self-regulatory program underway. And those are some of the developments, the status that I need to educate myself on, where things are, what progress has been made. But the FTC has, in the report, recommended that it didn't say whether through legislation or through self-regulation, but that this would be a good option for consumers to have.
Now, one of the tenets of that report is that companies should make privacy the default. Mm-hmm. Do you agree with that?
Well, I think one of the tenets of the report,
or the do not track should
yes.
be the default.
Well, it's a little more nuanced than that. I would say one of the tenets of the report is that companies should include privacy by design. So when they're coming up with products, when they're coming up with services, they should think about the privacy implications right at the beginning. And I think that's very good best practice for companies to undertake. If they're collecting information that they don't need, or if they're storing it in a way that's not secure, that's something they really need to pay attention to, because I think consumers do care about privacy, and it would be better if privacy was considered as one of the principles at the beginning. So that's one of the things that the report has. Now, as for whether do not track is an opt-in or an opt-out issue, that really depends, I think, on consumers' own preferences. So whether most consumers don't want to be tracked, or they don't care, or they just want to have the option not to be tracked when they're doing certain activities. And that's sort of one of those things I'd like to find out more about myself.
Maureen Olhausen, what issues are on the horizon for the FTC that we haven't talked about?
So, the FTC, you mentioned that, they're very prominent in privacy, and they kind of so I was there in the 90s, and one of the things they did as the internet really started to become a consumer, a consumer experience, consumers use the internet a lot, the FTC got out ahead on that issue and paid a lot of attention to privacy and deception and things online. And what we've seen now is that so much internet access has moved to the handset, to consumers accessing it over their smartphones, and that creates unique challenges for disclosures, for what kinds of information is being collected, location information, things like that. So the FTC needs to understand the challenges, what consumers are facing, the issues, and also the benefits that online access through the handset offers consumers. So the FTC is doing some workshops and outreach to industry and paying attention to those issues. And I think it's very important to stay ahead of the curve on what's happening.
Should there be different standards for wireline or for wired broadband and wireless broadband?
Well, I guess it depends on what you mean by different standards. So, for example, there's a challenge in giving a disclosure on a handset has the phone has a very small screen, so there might be, a different way to inform consumers that you need to use in that environment, because the FTC is always paying attention to the consumer's point of view and what what kind of information does the reasonable consumer need to make an informed choice. So if the technology is different, if the experience for the consumer is different, then that might suggest that there should be somewhat different standards. But I don't think that generally, you have to create a whole different set of standards for one versus the other.
Most people aren't lawyers, but they
Thank
hit
God.
You are?
Yes.
They hit do you read the user agreements? Do you read those?
And it really depends. Like for some things, I've certainly read it. I use Gmail, and I've read it for that, and I've accessed it for. I have a neglected Facebook page. I'll be honest, it's up there, but I don't update it very much. But I did read the privacy settings for that. So, but for some other things, I can't say that when I go on, another very well-known website where I'm just, purchasing a book or a CD or something like that, that I, check out the privacy policy that closely, because I'm not particularly concerned about the information that I'm providing them and the way that it can be used.
Do you think there's an effort, or do you think there should be an effort to simplify those agreements so non-lawyers can understand them a little bit better?
I think that would be a good goal for companies to pursue. You sort of need to strike this balance between simplicity, ease of use, just giving people sort of the high-level points versus, some people really care about the details. And one of the things that we have in this market is kind of the learned intermediary, the consumer group who pays very close attention to, every sort of twist and turn in a privacy policy. So one of the things the FTC has suggested in other contexts is sort of a layered approach. So where you sort of get the high-level issues kind of right at the top, the bullet points, and then that can link into a more in-depth discussion for the people who really want to know sort of the nuts and bolts of things.
But not necessarily something the FTC should require?
Yet to be determined whether the FTC should require, because it really all has to go back to what harms are consumers experiencing. So if consumers are being harmed, then the FTC would need to look more closely at that. But a lot of information on financial information, medical information, things like that, already has some protections, and the FTC has pursued a number of cases in those areas. So I'd have to see if additional protections and requirements are necessary.
Speaking of medical information, the use of medical records online, is that something that the Federal Trade Commission is working on?
So the FTC actually started paying attention to that issue a number of years ago while I was there, because you have HIPAA that protects a lot of medical information, but that only extended to healthcare providers. So when you started having services that allowed consumers just to upload their medical records so that for ease of use and so you could transfer it easily and access it easily, there was a question of what applied there, and it turned out the FTC Act would sort of be the main regulation there. That has since changed as people started paying more attention to that issue. So I think that the High-Tech Act actually addressed some of that.
Maureen Olhausen, one of 2 Republican commissioners.
Yes.
3 Democrats currently, because the president is a Democrat. What's the comedy level on the commission?
I think it's very good, actually. For the FTC, most of the work we do is unanimous, it's bipartisan. I support a lot of the enforcement that the FTC does in these areas. But there's a reason that it's a multi-member commission, which is to have a diversity of viewpoints. So there will be times when we might disagree on something, but I think we all understand, respect each other's views. This is, the way good policy is made is to have an open and frank discussion among policymakers. So I think that it's actually a very functional and bipartisan agency.
And when we've talked with members of the Federal Communications Commission, we've talked a little bit about the sunshine laws. Are you allowed to meet with more than one commissioner?
Right, so we are under the same requirements as the FCC and the Sunshine Act. And that can create a little, it's hard to have a discussion if you can only talk to one person at a time. We use attorney advisors and who kind of can talk to the other offices. But in some ways it creates a little game of telephone tag where the message can get a little distorted. So the FTC actually does occasionally have meetings where all the commissioners get together to talk, and it's on the record, though it's not public. So that's a way that we can address that. And actually, we're meeting to discuss an issue, not necessarily to take an action. So that is an option that we can pursue.
Maureen Olhausen, one of 2 Republican commissioners on the Federal Trade Commission, joining us here at the Cable Show in Boston. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Peter.
And now we're pleased on the Communicators to be joined by another member of the Federal Trade Commission. This is Julie Brill, one of the 5 commissioners, a Democrat.
Yes.
Commissioner Brill, if you would, start by giving us just a synopsis of your biography. How did you end up at the FTC?
Absolutely. And it's great to be here, so thanks for having me. I have been on the commission now 2 years, a little bit over 2 years. I was appointed by President Obama and confirmed by the Senate, of course. But for about 20 plus years prior to coming to the Federal Trade Commission, I was a regulator. I did state law enforcement at the state level for state attorney generals. First, I worked for over 20 years in the Vermont Attorney General's office, and then I worked for about 14 months in the North Carolina Attorney General's office. And in both positions, in both states, I focused on consumer protection and competition regulation and enforcement work. And that's exactly what I get to do at the Federal Trade Commission. So now I get to focus on all the policy issues and all the law enforcement issues that we did in the states, but now I get to do it on a national level.
So what brings you to the Cable Show here in Boston?
Well, the Cable Show is one example of a forum where industry that is actively engaged in innovation, I mean really pushing the forefront of innovation, comes together and shows their stuff. They're here to show off. And I'm here to see all the wonderful ways in which industry is innovating to bring consumers new products and services, and to begin to think about what issues any of these products and services might raise from our perspective, both with respect to consumer protection and also with respect to competition issues.
Well, Commissioner Brill, have any issues been raised in your mind as you wander the floor here?
I think one of the biggest issues that we see as you wander the floor is how everyone is moving to the internet. Everyone is going to be offering their services no longer through a box top or whatever, or cable, but I mean they will offer that, but they all are moving to what will be a very powerful platform, and a platform where consumers will really be able to access their services with any mechanism that they're using, with any device that they're using. And what it says to me is that many of these large platform providers, whether you're talking about a cable company or whether you're talking about a social network, they're not here, but we do a lot with respect to social media, for instance, they're all involved in providing broad services to consumers, lots of information going out to consumers, but they're also potentially able to collect a lot of information about consumers. And I think that we need to, as law enforcement and as an entity that focuses on competition issues, we need to look at the ways in which these players are actually treating consumers the same way, gathering information, in a very similar way, and how we want to be thinking about the competition that they're engaged in with each other, and also what it might mean for consumers in terms of how they're collecting information, what information they're giving to consumers about collecting and using personal information to show ads and things like that. So a lot of issues come up for me as I walk the floor.
Well, there were two issues that struck me in your answer there. Convergence and privacy.
Yes.
And if we could start with convergence, there's a current spectrum deal, something that the FTC doesn't necessarily deal with, but there's a current spectrum deal between the cable companies and Verizon. Is that a competition convergence issue that concerns you?
It's something that, there are lots of folks in Washington who are thinking about that. I'm more thinking not so much about that specific spectrum issue, although it could raise competition issues that we might want to look at. I'm thinking about really the large platform providers and how they affect consumers actually in terms of the second issue that you raised, the privacy issue, and what it means for consumers to have all these different players who are kind of converging to a business model that says we're going to use consumers' information to provide them services, to help fund the services that we're providing, but we're going to be marketing to them based on their information, and what does that mean? So that's the kind of convergence that I'm looking at in terms of, from a consumer perspective, how are consumers being treated by these entities, and what we should be thinking about it in that context.
Commissioner Julie Brill, the FTC, there's been recent reports. What's the status with the Google privacy issue?
Right. So we are in the process, actually with respect to Google, we have finalized a consent order that came out of Google's efforts, its first social media effort involving Google Buzz, which people may remember was a couple of years ago. Google essentially took consumers' information, their email contacts and whatnot, and populated this first social media with consumers' contact information. Consumers never expected that. A lot of private information came out of that, where consumers, their most frequent email contacts might have involved a potential employer, might have involved a patient if they were a doctor, all sorts of potential deep privacy concerns. We put Google under an order that requires them to develop a broad privacy program that will cover Google Buzz, it will cover Google Plus, it will cover all of Google's activities and services, YouTube, everything. And they have to have a comprehensive privacy program. They're going to also be subject to audits for the next 20 years, so that an outside entity will be looking at their comprehensive privacy program. So that's the status right now of what is publicly being done with respect to Google on privacy. We are always looking at new issues as they're raised, and there are always lots of issues with respect to Google.
Now, do you see the Google settlement, as it were, as a model for other companies?
Absolutely. In fact, Facebook is also, we've proposed a consent order with Facebook that involves some of the changes that it made in 2009 to its privacy policy and to how it was using consumers' information, and it very much picks up on a lot of the provisions that are in the Google order. So for instance, it too would require Facebook to have a comprehensive privacy program that covers all of Facebook's services and be subject to outside audits for its comprehensive privacy program for 20 years. Now that order is still proposed, it hasn't been finalized yet.
Julie Brill, self-regulation is a term we've heard around here, especially up here at the cable show. Michael Powell used it, a couple of other industry officials.
Sure.
What's your view of that?
I think self-regulation can be very helpful. I think self-regulation is a tool that can be much more responsive to changes in the marketplace in a quicker way than regulation, or certainly than passing laws, can be. And we at the Federal Trade Commission have actually urged certain segments of industry to engage in very robust self-regulatory efforts. For instance, do not track is an issue that is essentially right now a self-regulatory model where we have been pushing industry to give consumers tools so that they can make choices about how their information would be used as they're traveling across different websites or across different services on the internet. So that is a model, the self-regulatory model can be a very powerful one. One of the things that I look for in any self-regulation context is whether or not it's robust. Is it providing good protections for consumers? And is there an enforcement mechanism? So that if a company that says that it's going to abide by a self-regulatory mechanism is not doing so, what are the consequences? Will we at the Federal Trade Commission be able to take action? If so, then it looks more like a robust self-regulatory model.
Do you think you have the ear of Congress at this time?
With respect to privacy issues, absolutely. I think it's not only our work on privacy, because we've been doing a tremendous amount of work on privacy, but the administration has also raised the level of the discussion because the Obama administration has come out with a big privacy report as well. So I think, yes, absolutely, Congress is very interested in the work that we're doing. There are many members of Congress who have been long interested in privacy issues and in how consumers are treated online and with respect to all these services that are collecting information about them. And I think they appreciate the congressional members who've been interested in this for so long appreciate a great deal of the work that we've been doing.
Commissioner Brill, wireless and wireline regulation, should they be the same?
At the Federal Trade Commission, we take the view that we need to be technology neutral and we need to look at things from a consumer impact perspective. So to the extent that, for instance, both wireless and wireline or landline providers are allowing third parties to bill. So the problem with cramming, which everybody probably knows about, that's the problem where consumers suddenly find services on their phone bill that they maybe ordered but thought, or maybe had a discussion with a salesman but thought they didn't order, or maybe never even heard about before. That's an inappropriate billing mechanism. It's called cramming. That can occur both on your landline bill and on your wireless bill. I think that kind of consumer impact needs to be dealt with in a technology neutral way, whether it's happening on a landline or it's happening in the wireless space.
And this is the Communicators on C-SPAN, and we've been talking with FTC Commissioner Julie Brill. The Communicators was on location for the 2012 cable show in Boston, and those were two members of the Federal Trade Commission that we just spoke with. Our coverage of the cable show continues next week. As a reminder, if you'd like to view any of the Communicators, you can go online to cspan.org/communicators.